Okay, so hi everyone, welcome to our ASIG meeting. My name is Sian McMillan. I am a committee member on the ASIG. For those of you who have joined our meetings before, you will be aware that our meetings are an opportunity to network and discuss various topics amongst academics, students, land managers, practitioners and consultants. We are trying in the presentations that we include in these meetings to provide opportunities to connect research and practice. In our last meeting, we actually had a really interesting discussion about infrared cameras and how they were being used for otter monitoring, in particular identifying resting sites. So tonight's presentation is a really nice sort of extension of that and how we can use the extensions of technology and innovations to further assist the ecological work that we're doing. We're very lucky to have three speakers tonight. Dr. Patrick White, who is a lecturer at Edinburgh Napier University and a member of the Centre for Conservation and Restoration Science. Dr. Lenny Le Goff, the Research Fellow in Machine Learning applied to robotics at Edinburgh Napier University. Sorry, I'll just make sure. Could everybody please mute? And also Dr. Antoine Cully, Director of Adaptive and Intelligent Robotics Lab at Imperial College London. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Patrick, who might like to share your screen.
Yeah, okay. Hi everyone, nice to see everyone. I can see a couple of familiar names in the list as well, so hello as well. So I'm just going to share some slides. Just 1 second. Are they coming through? Okay. Great. Thank you. Great. Okay. Okay. Hi everyone. I won't be able to see everyone while I'm talking with the slides. So if you've got any kind of questions or you know, want to chip in, please put your hand up or you know, come on. Yeah, so thanks for coming along. So yeah, my name's Patrick White and I'm a SIEM member and I'm also a committee member of the Academia Special Interest Group. And not all of our talks are by committee members, but I volunteered to do this one. I was eager to do something on robots for the Academia Special Interest Group, particularly as it kind of fits into our idea of kind of evidence-based practice and innovation, etc. And so today we're going to be talking about robotics, and I've called this Meet the Robotics Scientist. You know, and we're lucky today. We've got Antoine Cully here, who'll introduce it in a minute a little bit more, and Lenny Le Goff, who a colleague of mine, who hopefully is be coming along soon. And we want to have a discussion about the role that robots might play in ecological survey in the future. So I'm not a roboticist scientist, and I'll talk a bit about kind of how I'm involved in the project later on, but I'm also an ecologist. I'm a research ecologist involved on the project. So two of the robotics scientists who are the eponymous Meet the Robotics Scientist today are, as I said, my colleague Lenny Le Goff, who's a research fellow at Napier, who hopefully will come along in a bit, and Dr. Antoine Cully, who's here with us now. Hi Antoine, thanks for coming along, who's at Imperial College. And as Sian said, he's a director of a laboratory that looks into adaptive and intelligent robots and also teaches in the area of robotics as well. So I'll be presenting some slides, but Antoine, Lenny, if you want to kind of chip in or contribute anything as we go, or if I say something wrong or you want to add to something I say, then that's great. And I said I'd talk a little bit about background. I'm not a robotics scientist, so why am I talking about robotics? Well, I'm an ecologist and I'm involved in this this project that we're doing between Napier University and Imperial College London. And I suppose where Antoine and Lenny come into this, and their colleague, Professor Emma Hart, is they're robotics scientists or computer scientists, and they're interested in applying their skills, which are very wide and varied in robotics and machine learning and computer science, into the world of ecology, and actually developing a robot, a terrestrial ecological surveying robot. So looking for application for those specific skills. And so ecologists at AP University, including myself, kind of connected up with the team to try and really sort of have a conversation about the ecological side of things, and what kind of things we do in ecology, what kind of surveys we do, what kind of things we need, what are some of the difficulties, etc. And so kind of in the background, I've been doing a literature review about robots in ecology, in ecological survey, which I'll talk about. And also about a month ago, we had a workshop where we had some kind of quite specialist ecologists who specialised in different areas of technology in ecology come together, and we had a bit of a workshop and discussion about what robots might be able to do, what might not be able to do, really a sandpit really about ideas for ecological survey. And I suppose in the background to all this, this is about robots, but actually there is a big interest in the world of ecology and ecological consultancy about technologies. So we use a lot of technology in ecology, and I think, as Sian indicated, our last discussion was about evidence-based use of camera traps, but we also use technologies like eDNA and LiDAR and image mapping and habitat mapping using images and all sorts of things, bioacoustics. And there's a really good article I'd actually point you towards in one of last year's issues of In Practice about technologies we might use in the next 30 years and how they might influence our profession. So the idea for today, I've got some slides really to introduce the idea of robots, and particularly robots in ecology, just to kind of set the scene and talk about, well, what do we mean, or what can we mean by what a robot is. I've also got some examples of robots because, robots in ecology is still kind of quite a growing and young field, really. Robotics maybe is a bit older than that, but in actually coming into ecology, it's quite young. And so actually people probably don't have an awful lot of experience of some of these robots because they're either very specialist, or robots that have been developed are actually still at the testing stage. They're not widely used. You're not using them every day on your surveys. So I've got some sort of slides to just talk through some robots that actually have been developed and are being tested. And then the idea of these sessions is they are a discussion. So please do ask questions, please do chip in ideas or thoughts or experiences you have. And some of the things we might be able to talk about today are opportunities. So what might robots be able to do? And particularly, what might they be able to do better than humans, or do more of, maybe do more efficiently, cheaper? Might they be able to do things more safely than us? And also, could they do things that just aren't possible now because of all sorts of constraints? And also challenges. Obviously, I initially wrote this down as negatives, but actually challenges, things that we maybe have to overcome. What are some of the things they might not be able to do at the moment, or some of the things you might, as ecologists, think, well, that's actually really something that requires a human. And then something that always comes up with new technologies or automation is, will they take away our jobs? And I've put in brackets, is that a bad thing? Because one of the interesting things that came out of the recent workshop we did with ecologists is that there was a general sense that actually often automation and things like robotic technologies, the types of jobs they take are sometimes the types of jobs actually people don't enjoy doing, repetitive, unsafe, dirty, boring jobs that they might be able to do. And maybe that'll be a good thing, and it will allow ecologists to spend more time doing interesting or things that require a human brain. So, and also, this is Meet the Robotics Scientist. So although I'm giving the presentation, it's a two-way conversation with the robotics scientists. So please, ask questions to them as well if you've got any questions. And no question is too silly. So please, if you've got any questions about robots, please do ask. I just wanted to sort of delve into the literature a bit here and talk about what we mean by robots in ecology, because I think probably everyone, when we say the word robot, something different pops into the head. And I'm pretty sure that what Antoine and Lenny think of a robot, it would be different to what an ecologist might think of. And some people might think of a domestic servant robot, like in the Jetsons. And some people might think of a lawnmower robot. Some people might think of some kind of spider-like robot, etc. And I found this really interesting paper that's accessible, which is, it's actually called the Dawn of Environmental Robotic Ethics or something like that. And it's quite an interesting paper about the ethics in environmental robotics. But I just thought this is quite useful in framing our discussion. Actually, environmental robotics is a very big field and might include things like where we have robots that are based on environmental things like biomimicry, where we might develop robots that swim like a fish or fly like a bird, for example, and also might contain ideas of, can we build robots that are environmentally friendly? But where we're sort of focusing today is more in using robots in ecology, and particularly in ecological survey. And so this study came up with quite an interesting kind of little taxonomy of how to consider robots. And some of you may have some experience of robots in ecology, or have sort of seen surveys done by them. And so they sort of classify robots in ecology as situations where ecologists take a robot that was developed for another purpose, or maybe a general purpose, and use it for ecology. And probably a good example of this is surveys using drones. Very often the drone was developed maybe for a general purpose, but ecologists have used it, have taken it on board to do habitat mapping, for example. So this is a good example of an off-the-shelf drone that's being used here to do plant surveys. Within that, more sort of narrow, is the field of what they call robots for ecology, which is actually where robotics scientists have actually developed robots specifically for an ecological purpose, an ecological surveying purpose. So for a very specialist task in our field. And here's an example of this robot. This robot is very specialized. It's a drone that can fly and land on water. And then it has this little probe that goes underwater to take water samples or images. And this is also an example of a marsupial robot, which hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about later. So this has been designed for a specific ecological purpose. And the other thing I'll just briefly mention is this idea of what we call ecobots, which is quite a cool sounding name. But ecobots, I suppose there's some overlap, but when we talk about ecobots, we mean robots that have been developed to provide some kind of ecological function that's maybe been lost or has been degraded. So kind of performs some sort of role in the ecosystem. And a nice example of this is this Cotspot in Australia, I think it is, which patrols coral reefs looking for crown of thorns starfish, which I think are native, but their populations have grown too big, basically, and destroying the reef because lots of their natural predators have declined. Populations have declined. So this basically acts as an artificial predator, and it's able to use a sort of form of image recognition to automatically identify crown of thorns starfish and kill them using a lethal injection. So there's different types of robots when we talk about robots in ecology, but we're going to really be focusing mostly on, robots for ecology, specifically designed robots. This just a little bit about robots in general, and what I found when I looked into the literature about robots in ecology is how people define a robot varies really widely. And a nice example of that is drones. Some people call a drone a robot, and some people don't call a drone a robot. There's lots of scientific papers out there about drones where they don't use the word robot, and there are other ones where they do. So it kind of depends on what it's used for, how autonomous it is, etc. And I sort of credit Lenny for this. he said his perception of what a robot is, or what a robot can be, is something that can move in some way, so it can locomote. It can interact with its environment somehow. It has a way to perceive its environment, so whether that's visually, or by sound, or by smell, or maybe tactile. And then it has some form of onboard computer that can process that information, and I suppose respond to its environment, and in the most advanced cases learn from its environment, and adapt. And so when we bring that into the world of ecology, it gets quite difficult. And again, I credit Lenny for these pictures, but robots, I suppose, have often been developed for factories or homes or environments like that, that although they have their challenges, they're, much kind of simpler environments. They've got much clearer objects, much clearer obstacles, and they're easier to move around. Well, I suppose apart from, for example, if it's a wheeled robot and there's some stairs, but within reason, it's easier to move around. Whereas, natural environments are much harder to navigate. You can see this environment here, and as one of the ecologists pointed out in the workshop we held, that in itself is not a complex environment. There are much harder environments that ecologists have to deal with, and so it's challenging for robots to move around. So, and also so it can be harder for them to perceive in that environment as well. And a few other things. I mean, if Anton and Lenny want to sort of contribute here, but having spoken to robot scientists, how we define a robot, how we categorize a robot, there's various different dimensions or spectra that we can kind of categorize a robot on. And actually, when I looked into the literature, robots vary across all these dimensions, I suppose. They might include, well, where does it operate? So we have examples of aquatic robots, terrestrial robots, or aerial robots, or sometimes a mixture. Sometimes robots can act in more than one, or contain elements that act in more than one. Some people would say, well, a robot is something that is autonomous and actually can learn and adapt. But actually, that's a sort of spectrum, and robots in ecology that I've come across in the literature vary from something that's effectively really remote controlled. It has a human operator, to something that actually is autonomous, acts on its own, and can also learn from its environment or plan its route, etc. And I suppose it's at that end of the spectrum that that's the kind of state of the art end of the spectrum, where roboticists and computer scientists sort of work together. And also specialization. Robots can be quite specialized, and potentially they might be over specialized. So if they become too specialized, they may not be adaptable to other contexts and other environments. And I was going to talk through some examples of robots in these that have been used in ecology, and we can sort of think of them in terms of these different sort of spectra or domains as we go through. As I said, I did a little bit of a literature search of robots in ecology. So I used this. Some of you will be familiar with it from university. This program called Web of Science, which is a repository for lots of scientific papers. And so I used search terms like robot, ecology, surveying, ecosystem, etc., and looked for examples where people have published papers about robots working in ecology. And the earliest paper I found was from about 16 years ago, from 2006. But it doesn't really date back any fully sort of new area of research of practice. And you can see it's sort of grown over the years, so not many papers published. It's still not many, it's still only in the single figures of papers published that meet those criteria, but it's growing quite rapidly, as you can see. And the other thing to note is that there's very few studies about terrestrial robots in ecological surveying. It's really dominated by robots that operate in aquatic environments. This dark blue color. Talked a little bit earlier about how terrestrial habitats are very, very challenging. And aquatic environments are challenging for humans because they're unsafe and they're difficult, and obviously we're terrestrial animals ourselves. But I suppose that kind of has probably stimulated more research in robotics, and also more of a need, for robotics in aquatic environments, because in some cases it might be the only way it's possible to collect data in a marine environment, for example. But also potentially, although the aquatic environment is challenging, it has a water column, and a robot can have a sort of neutral buoyancy. So actually, in some ways, an aquatic environment is potentially easier for a robot to move around in 3 dimensions than a terrestrial environment. I've put caveats at the bottom here because obviously these are for robots. So this doesn't necessarily cover every robot that's been developed, because some might not be published in scientific papers, some might have commercial confidentiality or other things, but it gives you an idea, a sense of the sort of trend in robotics, and it is increasing. And so I think over the next few years, we're going to see more and more potential use of robotics in ecology. So I'm just going to talk through a few sort of example robots that you might or might not be aware of as we go through. I've prioritised a few sort of interesting ones first, because I was worried I might sort of overrun my time before we get into a discussion. But just some examples here, and I've provided some little URLs for all of these. So if you watch back the recording afterwards, you can go and find out more information about these. But this was an interesting robot that actually I was made aware of, that's used within the Amazon, so within a kind of complex forest environment. And it's part of this thing called Project Providence, which is a biodiversity monitoring program. And this is actually a legged robot, which is actually relatively unusual for robots in ecology, actually. And I was going to put this one later, but I brought it forward because I thought it was an interesting one. And it's quite advanced. I think it's kind of quite autonomous in the way it acts in terms of its activity. And it's still sort of at the development stage, but I think the legged system allows it to be much more adaptable in terms of the environment that it can be moved in. And there's an example here of a sort of picture it's taken of an invertebrate. So I think one of its roles is to go around recording images or collecting other kinds of data. Legged robots, actually, maybe I could bring in Antoine briefly here. Legged robots, I know, is an area that Antoine's worked in quite recently, and wrote a paper about developing, I suppose, sorry Antoine if I kind of butcher the explanation, but developing a system whereby a legged robot could adapt if one of the legs became damaged, and so that ability to learn how to walk more efficiently if it sustained damage to itself, which in itself would then increase its ability to function in complex environments. Which I suppose you can talk about, Antoine, if you want to at the end. So that's an example of a legged robot, but actually not that common within the field, within ecology. Robots can often function in the air, so we have aerial robots, and as I said, there's a little bit of an overlap with sort of drones here, and sometimes quite simple drones are called robots. And other scientific papers don't call them robots. But this is an example of a drone that I think is relatively advanced in terms of its function. And this is for a paper from 2020. Drones have been used to collect radio tag data in ecology. Obviously, I don't know if any of you have done radio tracking studies, but it can involve lots of kind of walking around or trekking around the countryside trying to triangulate lots of animals. It's a big task. So people have started to employ drones to collect this data. So animals are fitted with radio collars, and the drone, as you can see in the top picture, it has aerials attached to it, and it sort of flies around the environment collecting data. But obviously, one of the potential problems with that is that this drone is buzzing over these radio tagged animals, and potentially buzzing over them multiple times to try and get an accurate reading, which could potentially cause disturbance. And that's maybe something we can discuss And when we talk about robots, is this disturbance element. You know, maybe that's the challenge of robots. Potentially could they cause more disturbance? But this is an interesting system in that they've developed software in this drone that actually intentionally plans travel routes to try and optimize kind of its battery life, so it can collect as much data as possible, but also to try and avoid animals. So it has this inbuilt algorithm to try and plan a route and make sure that it stays at least 50 meters away from the animals it's trying to survey. And you can see some sort of simulation maps here at the bottom. So these kind of squiggly graphs at the bottom, they're actually maps. So the blue is the track of the drone. And you can see on the left-hand side a test of this robot fitted with this algorithm to maintain a safe distance from the target species. And then on the right, without it, you can see that it's got these big gaps, these voids in its paths. So it's managing to actually skirt around the animals and not cause them disturbance. And I said that, you know, a lot of robots are aquatic, and this is a good example of a kind of aquatic type robot doing a sort of similar function actually to what a lot of drones are used for in terrestrial environments, which is habitat mapping. But this is doing habitat mapping in a more, I suppose, a more challenging environment under the sea. And this is a robot. You can see it's the shape of it obviously is influenced by where it is. So it's a kind of torpedo shape, hydrodynamic, goes through the water autonomously. And this robot's actually designed to map seagrass habitat in the Mediterranean, which is an endemic, endangered or threatened habitat. And it's got different levels of autonomy. So it's kind of autonomous in terms of its tracking. I think it follows a sort of planned survey route, but autonomously. But one of the interesting things about this is it uses image analysis to identify seagrass autonomously. So it's able to identify seagrass on the sea floor. It's also able to do stuff like identify healthy seagrass versus seagrass that's dying, and also seagrass versus other kind of vegetation communities on the sea floor. And then it uses sort of image analysis to determine where the seagrass is distributed. And then obviously it can look at trends over time in terms of seagrass cover or relations to other factors, disturbance, threats, etc. So that's an example of an aquatic robot. So we've seen terrestrial with the legs, we've seen aerial, and we've seen aquatic. Just checking how I'm doing for time, Sian. Are you okay for me to carry on to talk through a few more robots?
Yeah, that's fine, Patrick.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say, should we see if anybody had any questions so far?
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, should we see if anyone's got any questions so far on what we've spoken about, or really anything relating to robots, robots in ecology?
Yeah, people are welcome to put any questions or comments in the chat, or if you wanted to unmute yourself and ask a question, you're more than welcome. So far, Patrick, I can't see anybody unmuting themselves. So if you wanted to continue with a couple more examples, then
yeah, okay, yeah. That's fine. Yeah, oh, I can see Lenny's there. Hi, Lenny. Sorry, I couldn't see images before. So, right. Yeah, so I'll just talk through some more examples of robots that have been used in ecology. Here's a question, actually. We've had C. Tansel, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. There is legislation around deploying drones, that's right. So, you know, I think I don't know an awful lot about that, but I think it's licensed, and that can depend on the country. Are there laws relevant to robot use? Good question. Yeah, that's a really good question. I suppose it would very much depend on what it was trying to do. Some of the functions of robots might involve performing things where a human would need a license to do, like, for example, monitoring at otter holts or something like that, or potentially surveying scheduled bird species or something like that. I don't know. So I suppose it would very much depend on that, but it's such a new field. I'm not sure. I don't know if Lenny, Antoine, if you know from any other fields of robotics, whether there are kind of laws developing around the use of robotics, and particularly where maybe robots have some kind of form of autonomy or artificial intelligence.
Yeah. I can quickly chip in. I think it's, as you said, Patrick, the main issue is that it's a very recent and developing field. So right now there is not really a lot of legislation. One good counter example are autonomous vehicles. When we had like all the big companies starting to all create the testing programs, mainly in California, for instance, the US government very quickly ramped up legislation to make sure that everything was in order. But as you said, for instance, right now in terms of terrestrial robots, there are very, very few of them. So it's not something that is likely to cause kind of a public disturbance or anything like this. So there is no legislation that I'm aware of. I don't know on your side, Lenny.
Yeah, no, I'm not aware. Like you said, I think it probably depends a lot of the countries as well, because the legislation are developing while the field is developing. So yeah, probably there is no legislation that I'm not aware of.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think so I suspect with some things it would require initially if a new robot were developed to do a task, it might require a conversation with a licensing body, and they might be a bit cautious initially. I suppose you'd probably need to kind of provide some sort of evidence base for the potential impacts that the robot might be having, and explain how it is minimizing disturbance. I suppose in similar, for example, if you want to get a license now for example, tagging a bird, putting satellite tags on a bird species, part of the licensing, you need to demonstrate proof that it's not having a negative impact on something like survival or breeding success. And that's part of the licensing conditions. So I can imagine the kind of same kind of thing, but it's such a novel area. And it probably really depends on as Lenny said, on your country, because if we take something that involves, something like, say, bird ringing, the licensing is very different depending on country, or putting tags on animals. Again, it really depends on what country. Some countries are very liberal in terms of allowing you to capture and tag animals. Some countries are very stringent in terms of their requirements, and it's very challenging to do that. So,
if I can add something, I guess that the robots they are tools. They can be considered as tools like camera trap or any kind of devices you can use for ecological monitoring. So I guess most of the robots, grown robots, will be considered can fall in the same legislation as also
yes,
you are using.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, and I think it will probably require a sort of step-by-step process. I know, for example, with camera traps, some of the licensing authorities, they give, for example, with camera traps at otter holts, I think Natural England sort of suggests that they have to be 4 meters away from the holt. But actually, the evidence shows that when they're 4 meters away, they're more or less useless in terms of detectability. So, there needs to be a bit of a kind of two-way conversation and a kind of gradual building up of evidence and confidence in terms of sort of how reliable the technology is and how it can be balanced out against what's, I suppose it's a balance between what new data is it creating to help us understand and protect kind of habitats and species versus the potential for disturbance or mistakes or errors. Steph has a comment here. Not really a question, just food for thought. I have noticed the lack of best practice guideline for using drones, perhaps an area that should be explored by same SIG groups going forward, especially if they're geared up to monitoring protected species. Okay, yeah, so that's maybe an example. I don't know an awful lot about I don't know an awful lot about guidance and best practice for drones. I haven't really done any drone surveying. I've been involved in a project, but I didn't do the drone surveying myself. It was with a colleague in Germany, but so I'm not sure. I don't know if anyone else has any drone experience that wants to come on and discuss that area of ecology. But the need for some sort of best practice guideline, definitely. I think that's always good to have good evidence-based guidance. You know, and you say it should be an area that's explored by ASIG groups. You know, so that may be something that you know, something that might fall within the academia special interest group. I know we've got an interest in evidence-based practice. C. Tansel, is it easier or more difficult to counter biases in robotic surveys versus human surveys? Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a good question. This is something that came up. I was sort of almost slightly surprised when we had this workshop with some ecologists. I kind of was slightly surprised they were sort of quite pro-robot, and you know, that they actually, there was a lot of thought that actually there are a lot of things that robots could probably do better once they've been ground truthed or validated or assessed, and we could be confident that the robot was collecting the data accurately. So let's say it was species identification or something like that, you know, or image analysis or something. Once it had been checked and sort of ground truthed, that actually it could do better. And one of the interesting biases that came up that people talked about a lot is sort of psychology and boredom at doing a repetitive job, and that, you know, if you start a task that's very repetitive, you probably do it differently at the beginning than sort of, you know, 5 hours later. That's potentially something that robots, maybe Antoine and Lenny have a thought on this, but I imagine they don't sort of suffer from that same level of fatigue. You know, that obviously power might go down, but they can potentially do the same task to the same standard again and again and again, etc.
Yeah, I think indeed this is a very good question, and this is as this is a new area to use robots for environmental monitoring. This is more like a question for you ecologists, like what kind of biases are introduced by humans and how we can tackle it with robots, and what kind of solution we can develop. This is like exactly the kind of stuff we want to work on. So actually, no, right now I don't know how we can counter biases with robots. You mentioned some solution, Patrick, but like just like knowing which kind of biases can be produced, we can maybe tackle them or maybe not. Depends.
Yeah. I think you're right. That's probably an area that that ecologists need to say these are the kinds of challenging survey techniques that are, you know, that potentially do have a human bias, and it might be a human doing the same thing over time, or it might be that what we call inter-observer reliability. So any two observers would do the same job but come out with different results. A classic one is habitat percentages. So if people are estimating if people are estimating vegetation cover within a quadrat, if you ask 10 people to do it, they'll all come up with 10 different answers in terms of, okay, this plant covers 50%, someone else might say 40%, someone else might say 60%, etc. And I suppose that's noise. There's potential for bias in a robot in that it might, if it's depending on how it's learned or trained, it might get it wrong every time. But if it's properly validated, then it could do it. Some of the examples that were brought up in our workshop were things like looking through thermal images for bats, you know, where you've got lots and lots of blank images and you've just got to look through them sort of hour after hour after hour. And I suppose humans just might suffer from fatigue or miss things as they go through. So yeah, that's a really, really good question. I suppose robots would come with their, like all technologies, they would come with their own challenges, but they'd have to kind of be managed. Laurent says, I know a number of guidelines, happy to circulate later. Thank you very much. That's about drones, I'm assuming. Annie, who's works the same. Like with eDNA, there'll be a lot more data generated by robotics. So is data management considerations a field of robotic development? When submitting species data, maybe there will be source data robots going forward. Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe that's one for the roboticists in terms of, you know, it will create a lot of data, you know, robots. One of the things we've talked about is how, I guess, robots can potentially be out in the field for much longer than humans, 24/7, obviously subject to power and not being stolen and things like that, but they can be out for longer, recording potentially constantly. That's a lot of information. How does that get managed? How much a part of robotics is that sort of management of all that information?
So actually, I don't think it's really a topic specific to robotics, but there is a very connected area of research, which is IoT, so Internet of Things, where the idea is to have a lot of sensors always monitoring the environment, and when I say the environment is typically have a couple of sensors in my house monitoring like every 15 minutes the temperature, the humidity, and I can track, and that is generating a lot of data on a daily basis, 24/7. And then we are actually stepping into the field of data science in order to try to infer something about the data that is generated. So there is indeed, robotics will open new ways to generate even more data, but then what to do with the data is a little bit outside the scope of robotic itself.
Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah, so I suppose that would require other solutions. Yeah, and I suppose generally ecology does produce a lot of data. If you think about all the biological records that are submitted all the time, there's huge amounts of data out there. This often comes up when you lecture at a university. There's often vast amounts of data that organizations hold that they've never looked at or never analyzed. It's just sitting there, and they're kind of wanting people to delve into it and see if there's anything in there of interest. So I guess it will only exacerbate that problem, but I guess it will give us more data to choose from. You know, if we know the ways, you know, if we know what we want to ask about that data, or we know the ways, what we want to try and find out. Yeah, thanks, Annie. Okay. Any more questions? Please put them in the chat. I'll just do a time check. Yeah. So. What I might do is just to stimulate some discussion as well, is just go through a few more kind of robots that I've highlighted in ecology. Might be interesting to people, but I'll keep an eye on the chat as we go through. Yeah, so I've given an example of a terrestrial legged robot, which is relatively advanced, and an aerial and an aquatic robot. This is actually one that Lenny told me about. Not a scientific publication attached to it, but it's a robot called Chico. That's I guess it's very adaptable in terms of it's the environment it can be moved, and I suppose it probably had a lot of investment behind it. It was developed by an oil company, Petrobras, in Brazil, and it's I guess you'd call it a wheeled amphibious robot. You can see here, this is actually a couple of different prototypes of it. There's a bigger one and a smaller one, and I think they're talking about even building a bigger one that potentially could carry a human inside it. But this is quite clever in terms of its movement, and it's got these big wheels that can act as wheels on terrestrial habitats, but also provide buoyancy, so it can move along the surface as well. So it's amphibious in the sense it can go on water and air, and it's able to. I think it's designed for. Assessing leaks along a pipeline, but for environmental purposes, because it's in a very sensitive habitat. C-Tancel. Sorry, I keep calling you by your initial because that's all that's on here. Apologies, C-Tancel. Can you see this developing beyond specific academic use for single projects to broad scale monitoring a legged robot in every SSSI? Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that's really, really a big question is this just an academic exercise? Like a lot of these are scientific papers still in the testing stage, or, when will we and how can we get to the point where robots are actually much more widely used and improving our kind of data collection? And I think when we, I know one of the areas that Lenny and Antoine are in their research group are sort of particularly interested in is and maybe tell me if I'm stating this wrongly, but is first of all is kind of longevity. So the ability for a robot that can stay out in the environment for a long period of time. Obviously, it would need to think about things like power and relaying data back to some central location. And also the ability to adapt and to sort of adapt what it's doing and learn from its environment. And I think this is very much something that had come up from our workshop, our discussion, was that a robot that could stay out in the environment for long periods and do long-term monitoring would be really, really useful. We're very much limited, ecologists are very much limited by resources. And often one of the criticisms of sites is we don't do enough long-term monitoring. And that would include things like post-development monitoring. And in theory, as you said a legged robot in every SSSI. You can have a robot that is fixed into a geographical area, and its job is to just wander around collecting either predetermined or maybe it will even adapt data for long periods of time, and I suppose it could either do that automated, or from a distance, if the ecologist suddenly thinks, I just want to check this area, or I just want to do a quick survey for this, it could be called into action, so that's potentially something that can do, and I think that's potentially something a robot could do. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, the roboticists, about that sort of long-term, that idea of a long-term monitoring, or whether does it always need a human to go out and put it in the environment and then sort of collect it in at the end of the day?
No, I completely agree with you. I think that's exactly why we want to design this kind of robots. But indeed, the state of robotics at the moment is, while we use very widely robots in all manufacturing processes, it's very difficult actually to bring robots outside the well-controlled environment of factories, and that's why we are kind of trying to, so with Lenny and Emma and other colleagues, we are trying to make robots that can survive and adapt outside factories for a long period of time without, having necessarily a human in the loop at every moment. There is also naturally the issue with the cost, because this kind of robots are usually, when it's a one-off project for academic purposes, usually the cost is very expensive, because it's a very specific bespoke system, and there is a little bit like a chicken and egg problem here, because in order to reduce the cost, we need to have like mass production, but in order to have mass production, we need to have mass clients, but if the cost of the robot is too expensive, we will not have the client, and so not the mass production, so not the reduction of cost. So it's a little bit also why sometimes this kind of, as you highlighted before, reusing existing robots from a different field like drones and recycling the robots to other purposes is an interesting way to go forward. And indeed, maybe right now we are experiencing this exact phenomenon. There are more and more legged robots like quadrupeds, dogs-like robots that are produced now by more and more companies, like for instance Boston Dynamics, that got purchased recently by Hyundai, the car manufacturer, and that is producing actually this kind of dogs like robots, the yellow robot called Spot that you might have seen on YouTube and so on. So the robots are actually commercialized for oil rig and per plant monitoring. And this is actually reducing, for instance, I would say 5 years ago, this kind of robot was costing like more than 100K each. Now you can buy same type of robot for $2,000 or $3,000, something like this. So thanks to this, we can say, oh, okay, now maybe the only thing we have to do is to improve the algorithm behind the hood, or maybe design some specific sensor for different application. And that actually is lowering the barrier of entry for this kind of application.
Okay. Thank you. That is really interesting. So maybe we'll start to see more use of robots, more robots in ecology, more use of these general robot systems as the prices start to come down and they become, I suppose, commercially feasible for surveying. And I guess the job of ecologists is to think about what they could be used for. You know, what are the applications that they could be used for? Yeah, which is one of the reasons for having these kind of discussions as well, is to you know, think about the applications that they could have. Yeah, okay, yeah. So we can see that, you know, potentially those robots would, you know, would come in, and hopefully this, as you say, hopefully it will not necessarily be an academic exercise, but start to actually see these robots improve how we collect environmental data. I suppose maybe if we talk about that, we're getting towards the end, so maybe just final thought, whether sort of people, you know, people see this as a positive or a negative, you know, this introduction of robots, or maybe that's a bit black and white. What are some of the potential challenges that robots might introduce? And we've got a room full of ecologists. Do people in general think that you know, robots, you know, can replace what humans do, or is it just another tool, another technology that will improve how we do ecology?
Left my glasses on the job there.
Hello? Is that someone trying to say?
So
Oh, sorry. So I think someone's trying to speak, but I can't hear very well. Sorry if you're trying to say something.
I think someone might have just been unmuted, Patrick.
All right, okay. I wasn't sure if someone was trying to say something.
I have a quick question. I'm gathering that in most cases at the moment, the robots that are terrestrial are accompanied by humans. You know, they're not sort of legged ones trudging around the Amazon on their own, or you know, are they likely to get damaged or stolen? Is it going to become like the infrared camera trap problem? Yeah, it's just wondering if you could make some comments about that.
You want me to chip in?
Yeah, please do, Antoine.
So definitely they are likely to become damaged, and that's a big issue and part also of my research. So I'm trying to develop some machine learning algorithms, artificial intelligence processes that will enable robots to overcome this kind of situation on their own. You know, by, for instance, when you have a six-legged robot like the robot we saw at the beginning of the presentation, if one of the legs is damaged, you can still walk with only 5 legs. And that's the kind of research and algorithms that we have developed in the past, and it can work. But indeed, there is a big risk of a robot to be stolen. So that's a bigger question, and I'm not sure if we have the answer at the moment. So we thought a little bit about using some camouflage and making sure that the robot can hide a little bit itself, you know, and not stay in the tracks of tourists, for instance, in parks. But yeah, indeed, that might be a challenge that we will have to overcome.
Yeah, because one of the big advantage of robots over camera traps is they can move. You can have like some avoidance strategy. But this is one of the things we want to tackle, indeed.
Yeah, and I suppose there's some situations where, for example, with acoustic recorders or camera traps, you're mostly interested in collecting data at night if it's nocturnal animals, but your camera is there in the daytime in full view. And, you know, so there may be as Lenny said, there may be a situation where a robot is able to, you know, during the times there's most risk of damage or theft, is to go and shelter somewhere or hide, and then, you know, come out and operate at night when there's less risk of that potentially, because it's not visible. So so you know, there are you know, potential things around there, but it is a potentially big issue with expensive technology, and it's another sort of thing that when people are choosing whether to use technology or just do a human approach, they also weigh up the risk of their investment, how much money they've spent on it, and what it's worth using.
that's why it's very important to try to use robots that are not too expensive, like Antoine described, and it will be much more possible to use these kind of tools in ecology when we will have like less expensive robots, smaller robots, which can replace more easily.
Yeah, yeah.
And also just to chip in, if we are more autonomous robots that we can deploy for a longer period of time, so that means that we can also deploy those robots in more remote regions. You know, that's, for instance, you might actually maybe want to use an helicopter to, you know, deploy the robot somewhere where you will have nobody else, you know, that can steal the robot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm conscious that we have only 2 minutes left, and we do try to finish on time. So perhaps I could thank Patrick, Antoine and Lenny for their wonderful information that they've shared tonight. I noticed that there were a couple more comments and questions in the chat. What we can do is save those, and perhaps we can address them and perhaps put it into one of our ASIG newsletters or something like that. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks again for the really informative presentation. It was a really interesting conversation and something really different. So it's nice to hear that different perspective. Our next presentation is on the 16th of June, and it is looking at COVID in animals. So another really different topic again. We hope that you can all tune into that. That should be advertised on the CIM events page in the next week or two. So please look out for that. Thanks again, everyone, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Everyone.
Thank you everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.